Yes. Okay, today we're going to talk about congruent figures, specifically, congruent polygons, but we're really looking mainly at triangles today, talking about congruent parts, how to name them. Most of it is stuff we've talked about, but we're just looking at like when they're not facing the exact same way or one triangle's moved, rotated differently, how to name those things, okay? So, first part, congruent polygons have corresponding sides, which means they have equal length, and corresponding angles of equal measure. Right, so if we know two triangles are congruent, three sides have to be equal. That doesn't mean all three sides are equal to the other three, but the three sides are equal to the other three sides, and then the three angles are also congruent. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just go through and name what are my corresponding sides, right? So before I give you an answer, if we're talking about side lengths, can anyone tell me what two side lengths are equal to each other?
X, V, and Q, N.
Let's start with the ones that are marked with 1. Just going in order.
XY.
Okay, so XY is congruent to what side on the other triangle? PN. How do we know that? Because they're both marked with 1 dash or tick. Okay? All right. What besides XY and PN? YZ. And what did you say that was congruent to? QP. Now, on these, does it matter if you switch the order that you write? Like, could you put PQ?
Yeah.
Yes, same thing. Okay? Somebody else give me the last two sides.
XZ and QN.
Good. Okay? Same idea works for our angles. So, who can tell me what my corresponding angles would be here?
P and Y.
Okay, angle P congruent to angle Y. Now, just as a reminder, I can use just Y and just P because there's no other possible angles for Y, right? So that's why I don't have to name with 3 points. We will see some other examples in a little bit. Okay, somebody else. What else besides PY?
Angle Z congruent to angle Q.
Good. Angle Z congruent to Q. And last one.
Angle N is congruent to angle X.
Good. Okay. Simple enough, right? We set the things congruent that have the same markings, so we know those two things are the same. Okay. Now, here's the one part where you do have to be a little careful. When I name triangle congruence, right? So if I say triangle XYZ, it does matter the order that I name the one on the left. So if I said XYZ, can anyone tell me how I would name the other triangle?
P, Q, N.
I disagree. N is the correct start. So
NPQ.
it is in PQ.
Why would it be that?
Okay, I'm gonna tell you the easiest way. Okay, if I start with X, how many markings are on this angle? 3, and then I went to Y, which was how many markings? 1, and then to Z, which is 2. So I went 3, 1, 2. So over here, I have to go 3, 1, 2. So in PQ. Okay. Now we could also say this is triangle YZX. So if I name YZX, I went 1, 2, 3. So over here, I would say PNQ. Okay, sorry, PQN. Now, here's the other reason this is important to us, right? Because we can use this triangle congruent statement, which we're about to do in just a second, to tell what sides are congruent and what angles are congruent, okay? Because when it's written like this, what angle did I say was congruent to angle X? N. Notice, which two did I write first in my triangle congruence? I wrote X and N, right? what two angles are in the middle? Y and P, which I said were congruent. And then what two angles are at the end? ZQ, which I also said was congruent. Okay, so we can use a triangle congruent statement to write corresponding angles and corresponding sides. Okay, so let's do that on example 2. We'll do sides first here. Okay. Can anyone tell me from that what sides would be congruent to each other?
MLAN.
Okay, so ML is congruent to what, Austin? AH. Right? Because ML are the first two listed, AH are the first two listed. So that is one pair. What else?
LE,
Say again.
LE,
LE, the last two, congruent to HB, also the last two. Okay? Then I have one more set of sides. What would that be? ME, which is first and last, congruent to AB, first and the last. Okay? All right, what about my angles?
Shakaya and Brent, please head back to Miss Dara's room at this time.
Okay, somebody besides Austin, because he's already went.
What are we doing?
We're naming angles now.
Angle M is congruent to angle A.
Okay. Somebody else? Austin, you weren't supposed to go. Okay, what about the last one?
E is congruent to B.
Thank you. Okay. All right, I want you to try the bottom one. Use congruent statement for the quadrilateral to write congruent statements for corresponding sides and angles.
So what we just did, but with another one?
Yeah, there's going to be 4 sides and 4 angles. Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you a second to list all those.
Wait, so that's a square, like QRST is the,
It could be a square, rectangle, any 4-sided figure. It doesn't really tell us, but it just tells us it's a quadrilateral. So just list your 4 sides that are congruent first, then go over and list your 4 angles. As you finish, you can kind of just check up, make sure you have the correct answer. Angles are usually pretty easy because you only have to do one at a time, right? First and first, second and second. Sides sometimes can trip us up. I just went the first 2, then the second 2, then the last 2, and then I went to first and last. Everybody okay with that? Okay, now let me ask this one question. What if we rewrote this as quadrilateral STQR? What would be my congruent statement for the other quadrilateral? YZ, WX. Because I went the first two and then moved those to the end. Okay, so YZ move WX to the end. Okay, as long as you keep the same order, you'll be okay. Yes, Rowdy.
Is there gonna be questions where they ask you to switch up the order and like match them?
Not necessarily. It's more so like I'm just kind of reminding you, like when we write one, we have to be careful about the order. Like anytime you write a congruent statement for a triangle, quadrilateral, the first one doesn't matter. You kind of choose the order. You just have to be then careful on the second one that you write. Okay. All right. Let's look at just a few things on the back page.
Do we have book work?
Today?
Yeah.
No, I have a worksheet. It's just easier because then they're kind of all printed out. Okay, now a lot of this on the back page these are different things that we've really already talked about and gone over, right? So what do we know about a reflexive side? They are the same, right? So reflexive is just a shared side by two triangles, and they're equal, or we'll use the word congruent. So on the first example, how could I name my shared side?
SPR and then
No, shared side, not an angle. PR, right? So PR is congruent to itself, right? Which should make sense. We know if two things share a side, that length of that line has to be the same. So we can say the two sides are congruent, okay? Same thing on example 2. You could also say HF is congruent to FH, right? It doesn't really matter if you switch that order. The two things are the same. The biggest, also, how could I mark this shared side? How many lines? 3, right? Because I haven't used that yet. Because if I only put one line, I'm saying that it's congruent to these two, and I don't know that it is, right? Now, again, this is just kind of stuff that will help us later as we start talking about proving triangles. But right now, we just need to know the basics, okay? Everyone's okay with that one, yes? This next one we should also know. What do we know about vertical angles? They're congruent. They're formed by intersecting lines and are congruent. Okay, we've talked about that one a lot this year. Now, if I'm going to mark these two angles here as being congruent, how many arcs do I need to put in them? 2. I can't put 1 because that one's already been used, and I don't know for sure that it's congruent. So I need to mark it differently. Now, can anyone tell me how I could state that those two angles are congruent?
angle X is
But how do I know if it's angle X is on the left or on the right? So remember, we can only use one variable if there's one angle definitively, and there's not here. So how do I rename that?
Do you have WX and CX?
WX what? WXV, yeah. So angle WXV, remember, it's either a single point or it's all three together, okay? So WXV, right? I said this way. How do I name the other line?
XTZ. Oh,
YZX.
Y.
that's a Y. That's a Y.
Yeah, it is a Y. I know it's kind of hard to tell. Here's the other thing I'm going to tell you. When we name these, right, I went from no markings to 2 to 1 on my angles. So I go from no markings 2 to 1, just as practice, okay? So angle Y, X, Z. Okay? All right? Can anybody tell me on the second example? Now, on this one, I can really just put one marking, right? Because none of the other, bless you, none of the other angles are marked. Okay, so how would I name the angle on the left? Say it, Joss.
DEB.
Angle DEB. Okay. Now this time I'm going to use sides. I went through one mark, through 2 marks. So I'm going to go through 1 mark, then through 2 markings. How would I name the second one? AEC. Okay. All right, then we're going to talk about midpoints. Midpoints divide segments into 2
Equal parts.
equal, or what word do we use? Congruent parts. Right? Now, you can never assume that something is a midpoint. It has to tell you, okay? Or, so here, what does it tell us right up at the top? E is the midpoint. The other way you would know this is if you had two marks like this. If I know those two bottom sides are the same, E has to be the midpoint. Agree?
Yeah.
Okay, so how could I name that those two segments are congruent?
K,
Not KG,
K, E.
KE. Yeah, KE is congruent to
E, W.
EW or WE. Okay, same thing on the second example. It tells you that D is the midpoint here, so I know these two segments are congruent. So MD is congruent to what?
T.
DT. Yeah, or TD. Okay. All right, last part. Angle bisectors divide angles into two congruent parts. We've talked about this before already, right? We know a bisector cuts something in half. So if AD bisects the angle BAC, what do I know about these two angles here? Yeah, these two angles are congruent to each other. How would I name those two angles? BAD, good. Then start from the other side. So if I started here, yeah. So if I started at B and went to A, then I got to start at C and go to A. So CAD.
We're a bad cat.
Okay. Lord. All right. So last one, DC bisects angle ACD. Those are already labeled with numbers. So can I use those numbers to write my congruent statement?
Yeah.
Yeah. Angle what?
1.
1 congruent to angle 2, which really, it's a lot easier when it gives you numbers in the angles, but most of the time it's going to look like the other. Okay? All right. Doable for this today?